Hello and welcome to all you sci-fi and fantasy fans. I am Technivorous and today I'm getting ready to watch the new Dune movie. Now, we're not going to watch it in this video. That'll be another video that I put up later where you'll get to see my reaction, and I will cut that down to a shorter video of some of the better reactions to some of the stuff that I'm hoping to be surprised and stunned by. So that'll be pretty fun. I'm really looking forward to watching this movie, but we're making this video right now to talk about Dune a little bit preemptively because it is something that I get really excited for and like to geek out about. And on that note, a lot of people don't know that the Dune saga written by Frank Herbert was also continued by one of his children named Brian Herbert and a gentleman named Kevin J. Anderson. And there are a lot of other books other than just Dune. Now, a real Dune fan knows that there are the Chapter House novels. There's Dune, Children of Dune, God Emperor of Dune, several Dune books. But there are actually some prequel books written by Brian Herbert, that's Frank Herbert's son, and Kevin J. Anderson. And this is Paul of Dune, and the misconception about this book is most of it has to do with Paul on Arrakis before they leave for Dune. And it really fleshes out his character really well. And one of the reasons that this book isn't really recognized as official story, I mean, it is canon in the world of Dune, but one of the reasons that it doesn't get as much attention as it should is because the original Dune novel was the story of Paul. And it's a very anti-hero story. Some people think it's the hero's journey, but we'll touch more on that in just a minute. But basically, Paul is very strong with being sensitive and his ability to use the Bene Gesserit powers that his mom has taught him. But he is kind of perceived as a weak child throughout the beginning of Dune. He knows some things, he's been taught some things, but it really is a story about his coming of age and coming into manhood. And in this book, there is a lot of stuff that it talks about that would make you think not more highly of him at the start of the Dune movies, or the start of the Dune series, but make you think he's a little bit more mature than he is presented in that literature. So, really good book, really interesting. They deal with a lot of the Gom Jabbar and some poisoning and some other secret Atreides poisons, and you get a lot of details about some of the assassins that the Atreides have working for them, which is interesting because they're really supposed to be the most honorable in this system. And at one point, Leto even says that, honor's kind of a facade. It's impossible for them to survive without people to protect them, and sometimes that means preemptive protection. It all makes sense in the book, and it's great. I'm bringing up this book because I found it at my local thrift shop, and it cost $2.75. So it's in great condition. It's still got the original cover. I was very happy with this. So we'll finish that up, and I'll give you a little synopsis to let you know how it turns out. Right now, though, let's talk more about that hero's journey proposition. So Dune is not necessarily the hero's journey. People look at it as such, and they want to empathize with Paul, and they want to see him grow and become this great hero. But at the end of the day, Dune is really about the fact that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And you can have the best of intentions, but once you go down that path to say, okay, I know what's best for everybody, you're really taking away people's rights and their ability to choose and the decisions that they make, and really their humanity, because free will is one of the things that defines that. So in the end, Paul recognizes that he becomes the villain. If you've seen Children of Dune, you know that he realizes that his name has become pretty much just a curse word, and he walks out into the desert to die. Spoiler alert, he doesn't die in the desert. Anyway, well, not at that moment. So I get really excited about this stuff, and I run off on tangents, and it's kind of hard for me to stay on topic because there's so much cool stuff, and this is one of the most filled, very deep, and there's a lot of exposition in this world, things that you need to learn about. In fact, when they released the was it the 70s they did that version of Dune, the theaters actually had to give out a pamphlet with the terms in it. Basically, it was a glossary of definitions, and nobody wants to sit there and flip through and read the definition of what you're trying to understand them talking about on TV. So this is one of the reasons that that movie kind of got a lot of hell from the critics. I've seen that version. It wasn't the first version that that's not true. Actually, something just occurred to me. Once, when I was younger, I walked in on my dad watching the old version of Dune. Didn't sit through the whole thing, but it was the scene where Paul and Gurney were fighting with the shields on, and I found it really, really interesting. But at the time, don't kill me, but at the time, I just knew that that was Picard from Star Trek, and I wasn't even a big Star Trek. I was really, really young, okay? So, that led to some interesting thoughts on science fiction for me, because I thought Captain Picard, I thought Star Trek and Dune, it doesn't matter. Anyway, the first Dune movie that I watched was the 2000 miniseries, okay? This was before I had read any of the books. I hadn't been too interested in that other movie, but I did watch it because I remembered my dad watching the older one. Some years later, I did go back after becoming a big fan and reading the books and watch the older one. And there are a few things in each iteration that I don't like. And there are a few things in each iteration that I think they did really well. And there are a few things in each iteration that I think that, this maybe didn't translate to the screen as well as you thought or as well as it should have. The first version, the one with Sting in it as Fade, had a lot of really weird inner monologues. So a lot of the talking, there were no mouths moving, and it was just scenic. It's a really interesting movie. It wasn't a bad movie in my opinion, and it was really, really true to the essence of the Dune books. But we've seen more and more lately, and I tend to agree with this, that when you take something from the page and adapt it to the screen, there are certain concessions that need to be made and things that need to be changed. And I think the constant voiceovers is one of those things. Now, in the 2000s version, they instead narrated each section by starting by reading the blurb by Irulan, who is actually the one who is writing these stories, because she's kind of cataloging the history of Arrakis and telling the story of Paul. Also, that is one of the reasons why the story of Paul picks up when they go to Arrakis. It starts there because that's pretty much the first she starts learning about them. But that was a little bit more subtle because you get an intro at the beginning and the end, and it tied the miniseries together. There were 3 parts to the original miniseries, and they did a really good job with that. In between, there was no... In the 2000 version, they talk a lot about how Muad'Dib is a curse word or a blessing and the power of the word. That was something that in the books and in the 70s version was a lot more predominant, but it didn't translate very well to the screen. At one point in the movie, they have blasters that are voice activated, so they have to talk to make them shoot. That's the trigger, and they say a certain word. And he discovers that his name is like the most devastating word to use with this gun. It's kind of interesting, but it's one of those things that is just kind of hokey as well. Vibration, sound, all that stuff, it has its place in sci-fi, and there are some really interesting things they can do with it. But this was just kind of a wonky translation. I did really like the weirding ways in the 2000 version. It was very, I don't want to say Matrix-esque the way he moved around. It was more like the Chronicles of Riddick, the Lord of the Underverse, when he fights him and he moves and his soul comes out and then comes back to you. It's a lot like that, and I really like the animation style. From the 2000 series of Dune, it did really well. It got a really good reception. People really liked it. There was really nobody famous in it. There were a couple of bigger names attached to ancillary characters or side characters, but nobody really super famous. So it's interesting to see a big name going on the big screen with Timothée Chalamet. I really do look forward to this. I'm excited. I know it's not the full first book, but that is a lot of stuff to get through. So I'm hoping that the way they break it up ends up being a little bit more even spacing to the story, because in the 2000s they made the sequel, which was Children of Dune, and that was one of the first things I ever saw James McAvoy in. He is a big Dune fan, and he did really, really great as Leto the Second, Paul's son Leto, one of the twins. But that was one of those series where so Paul's story really doesn't end until he has that moment with Leto in the desert. So Paul is just a wanderer. Leto is not even sure that it's his dad. He knows, but the words aren't really spoken, and they have this moment. And he tells him, no, I'm going to take the golden path. And Paul says, you think I didn't see that? Because it's the next step that Paul would have had to take in. It's the reason that Paul left, because the only way to control the whole galaxy is to use an iron fist. So Leto kind of accepts that and says, hey, I'm going to decide what's best for everybody, and becomes the God Emperor. He puts the sandworms on his skin and becomes a big worm. That was a really, really good series. I liked it, and I think that they did a great job of picking what could go well on screen and leaving some things out. I won't get too much into that. If you're a fan of the books, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But my point is, I think Paul's story ends more right there, and Leto's really begins before that, obviously, but it doesn't really pick up until there, when he decides that he will take the golden path. So there's a lot of places they could break these stories up, and I think a fuller, more complete story of Paul from beginning to end would be amazing. But you also have to realize that Timothée Chalamet is really, really young. So in order for them to age him and have him play an older gentleman or a father figure to a 20-year-old Leto, he's probably going to need to put on some weight and a couple of years. So I don't want them to get there too fast. There is a lot, like I said, a lot of material to cover here, and I'd like to see them cover as much of it as possible. I really liked Fade in the 2000s version. Wasn't the biggest fan of Sting, and the whole 70s version, it was just a weird ending. The one of the most prolific things that I think that really drove me to be a fan of Paul, even though he's not a hero, I still root. There were points when I'd root for him to just smash the rebels. You know what I mean? Like, that's the total opposite of how I feel about most things, where when you go into the Star Wars universe, I feel like the Empire is a horrible thing. Well, there's really no difference between Emperor Palpatine and Paul Atreides. They have very, very similar views. They do whatever they need to do by co-opting an army and manipulating people to take power, and once they take power, they try to wield it with an iron fist, and they take it absolutely. The main difference is that Paul really does have the best of intentions for the people, but you can't be perfect for all the people all the time. Whereas the Emperor, however, just kind of covets power, and that's all he wants is absolute power. So, I'm really looking forward to watching this. I've put out a lot of my thoughts and ideas in this video about how I feel about the previous versions of the movie, and I will have another video on how I feel about this version after the reaction video. But for right now, I'm really, really excited, and I'm going to kind of try and tamp my hopes down a little bit. That way I don't end up jaded or disappointed. I don't expect it to be... the 2000 version came out for me at a very pivotal point in my life. I was about the age of Paul, and I was... I could relate, I don't think I'll have that same connection with this movie, but I'm really hoping that it grabs me and holds me in, and that I'm just dying to see the next piece. So we're going to start it up here in just a minute, and I'm going to end this video here. Let me know what you thought if you've seen it. Let me know what you were skeptical about going into it, and leave that in the comments down below. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and leave a like on this video, and ring the notification bell. That way you get notified when I post the reaction video and my synopsis. There are obviously spoilers in all of these except the reaction video. I'll try not to tell you what's going on in case you haven't seen it. But yeah, that's basically it, guys. We'll see you in the next one. I have a lot of stuff to cover on this channel in the coming weeks. As you can tell, Wheel of Time is going to be starting up, and I do plan on doing a series that revolves around each episode of that. So let me know if you're interested in that as well. That's going to be it for this one, guys. Technivorous out. We'll see you in the next one.